Hi, everyone. My name is William Edelglass. I serve as Director of Studies here at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies in Barry, Massachusetts, which is on the traditional homelands of the Nipmuc Nation, many of whom live in the area today. And before I introduce Rick Hanson, I'd like to give you some sense of how the evening will unfold. First, though, if you would like to have closed captions and be able to read the text in real time, you can press the button. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, it says live transcript, and there's a little CC above live transcript. You can press that button and you will get a transcript of everything that's being said. Though sometimes the transcript is a little funny. So we're going to begin with a short grounding meditation to settle in, and then I'll ask Rick some questions to explore the intersection of neuropsychology and neuroscience and meditation more generally, as well as focusing on the particular themes from the article that he published in the BCBS Insight Journal, which was published earlier this month on suffering and craving and letting go of suffering and craving. And after about 45 minutes, we'll open up the conversation, and anybody who wants to can pose a question for Rick. That said, there are a lot of people in this call, and we won't be able to get to everybody's question, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. If you would like to ask a question, you should feel free at any time to write your question in the chat at the bottom of your Zoom bar. And if at any point you are having technical difficulties, you can send an email to contact@buddhistinquiry.org. And thank you to my colleague Julia for making all of these logistical processes work so smoothly. So I would like to give an introduction to Rick Hanson, who is a psychologist with a particular interest in how neuropsychology can support our well-being. This will be a brief introduction compared to what I could do, but my preference is to have time to hear Rick speak. Rick is a senior fellow at UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center, also a New York Times bestselling author, and an expert in the area of positive neuroplasticity. And as I understand his expertise, one of the contributing factors is that Rick has been meditating since 1974, almost 50 years. He served on the board of the Spirit Rock Meditation. Did I not say that?
No, that's right. I was like, well, what have I been doing all that time? Why am I not farther along? But anyway, keep going. Sorry, William.
um, so he served on the Spirit Rock Meditation Center board for almost a decade and has taught at meditation centers around the world. And as you can tell from the titles of Rick's books, his particular focus has been exploring and integrating the findings of neuroscience with the Dharma. So Buddha's brain, hardwiring happiness, the new science of contentment, calm, and confidence. Just one thing, developing a Buddha's brain, one simple practice at a time. Resilient, and his most recent book, Neurodharma, New Science, Ancient Wisdom, and 7 Practices of the Highest Happiness. And I feel like Rick's work, in my mind, what's distinctive about it is he's offering practices and insights to help us cultivate a greater sense of peace, contentment, confidence, compassion, and promoting resilience and more positive relationships in our lives. And he does so that is grounded both in the findings of contemporary science, but also a deep connection to the Buddhist traditions, especially the Vipassana tradition. And of course, if you're interested in learning more about Rick's work, there is a lot on his YouTube channel and at rickhanson.net. And he's also founder of the Wellspring Institute for Neuroscience and Contemplative Wisdom, where he makes this work very accessible, and you can find more there. And I should say, unlike some very busy teachers or teachers who have a bio like that, Rick practices what he preaches. While we were working on preparation for this event, Rick was often out rock climbing for a few weeks in the Sierras, sending me gorgeous, gorgeous pictures of mountains and lakes. So I'm so glad you're with us, Rick. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. And it's really an honor to be here. BCBS is one of my two primary spiritual homes, the other being Spirit Rock Meditation Center. And there's something about the setting, the people, the integration of study and practice that's unique to BCBS that I personally relate to. So when William invited me to have this conversation with him and with you all participating, boom, heart leapt at it. You betcha. He's invited me to do a little meditation with you, and I'd like to share with you a meditation I do myself often. It's this one you can do it at length. We'll do it briefly for 2 to 3 minutes. So I invite you, and feel free to adapt my suggestions to your own experience, to find a posture that is comfortable and alert, has a sense of ease and a kind of relaxed dignity in it, perhaps. And then with your eyes open or closed for the next couple minutes, see if you can sustain awareness of the sensations of breathing in your chest as a whole. This is a sense of sensations on the left and the right together. Front and back together, top and bottom together. Breathing while feeling your chest as a whole. And as you feel your chest as a whole, let awareness be open and wide, expanding, spacious. And as we finish up, you can let a sense of ease or calming or whatever is beneficial that you've been experiencing sort of spread out inside you. Allowing yourself to receive the benefits of your practice, whatever they have been. Those benefits sinking into you and becoming a part of you, so that increasingly you take them with you wherever you go.
Thank you, Rick.
Okay, thank you.
So, as one can hear from the meditation you just led, you bring to the work you do a background as a Dharma teacher, someone who leads Buddhist retreats, Dharma retreats, and also someone who has a background in psychology. And I'm wondering if you could say how those two streams have worked for you in your life, how they come together, and a little bit, you could share a little bit about your background.
Yeah. Uh, Briefly, and what a long, strange trip it's been, right? So, but briefly, I landed in college, UCLA, in 1969. I was pretty young, and it was full tide in the human potential movement. So my kind of initial entry was in psychology, especially the more transpersonal and humanistic aspects of that. Then at the very end of my college time at UCLA in spring of 1974, not entirely sure why I needed to fulfill 12 units to graduate. So I did through independent study, and I thought, oh, let's learn about Eastern philosophy and religion, which I knew nothing about. And boom, that was my access, my initial access to contemplative practice, mainly in the Buddhist tradition. So there I was, spring of 1974, long hair, gold rimmed glasses, playing my wood flute in the hills, thinking I was meditating, kind of naive beginner. And still there was something about it that immediately got me like, wow, this is real. And the kind of the core Buddhist teachings that everything is connected and changing. And if we align with that truth, live harmoniously with it, we suffer less and harm less. And on the other hand, if we struggle against the interconnectedness and transience of things, well, then we create suffering and harm. And that just really rang true for me. Then, as I wandered in my life through my 20s and 30s and got a PhD in clinical psychology, I'd kept up my contemplative practice. And then beginning roughly 20, 30 years ago, a sort of critical mass of information began to develop in the field of neuroscience, brain science. And it became increasingly possible to start to map respectfully and loosely, very important, but respectfully and loosely map connections between and among our psychology, contemplative practice, and the underlying activities and structures of the living body, notably its nervous system, whose headquarters are the brain. So then over the last 20 or so years, I've been really working and practicing at the intersection of psychology, contemplative practice, especially Buddhist practice, and neuroscience. And for me, the intersection of those three domains, think about where three circles overlap, it's just full of really interesting stuff that's very practical. And I think that that's been kind of the basis for what I've been doing over the last 20 years.
So that intersection is, well, in the title of our conversation, we use the term neuropsychology. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to just say a little bit about what neuropsychology is, or how would you define neuropsychology?
Sure. I think it's helpful to start with a squirrel. And I know that BCBS, you have some squirrels, and there are definitely squirrels in my backyard. So a squirrel, by all accounts, appears to be hearing, seeing, tasting, touching. It experiences pleasure and pain. It sleeps, it wakes. It has loyalty to its little babies. It competes with other squirrels. Squirrel is having experiences. What's the physical basis that enables a squirrel to have experiences? Or us? We too are hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, remembering, wanting in much more complex ways, but still, there are a lot of parallels. And one theory, one view, is that somehow the squirrel or the human is like a radio receiver, and some sort of consciousness stream is being beamed in somehow, somewhere. And that's what's happening. A modern scientific view would be that the experiences that a squirrel is having are enabled minimally and constructed in some sense by underlying physical processes whose function is to process information. The function of the nervous system is to process information, and in ways that are still unclear. And people talk about the hard problem in consciousness, and it's a hard problem. How do we go from clearly the physical processes of the nervous system, which are very discernible at lots and lots of levels. You hit yourself on the head, you get the impacts of that. You drink a little caffeine, you see the impacts of that going the other way. Okay, so you have physical processes. It's clear that they are processing information. It's not clear how we move from information processing to phenomenology, to the experiences of a squirrel, or what it's like to be a bat, Thomas Metzinger's, famous approach, or what it's like to be you right now, right? But still, it seems clear that absent what might be supernatural or transcendental, the streaming of consciousness, the experiences that we're having, require and are being continually constructed by underlying physical processes. So why not study those physical processes as we become more aware of them? The Buddha had no access to that, right? And the approach that I and others have been engaged with for the last 20 years is not in any way to replace Buddhism. And I think it's really important to appreciate that traditional practices work. You don't need an MRI to become enlightened. You don't need an EEG to become enlightened. The only question is, might the new understandings of the ways in which the body is making the mind, might they add value? And I think they can in many, many kinds of ways, including, for example, bringing us home to our bodies respectfully and humbly to appreciate that it is the living biology that is making the mind. In some ways, perhaps in a larger context that involves unconditioned, perhaps timeless, even mysteriously conscious and loving processes. And that's a whole conversation. But certainly within, at a minimum, when you realize, wow, it's this body as the result of 3.5 billion years of evolution, especially the last couple, 100 million years of neurological evolution, that is continually constructing consciousness. Thank you. It's humbling. And that's just one of the many benefits, I think, of truly, as Evan Thompson put in the title for me, his masterpiece book, grounding mind in life. Not reductionistically, but with a sense of wonder, awe, and looking for what might be useful pragmatically for practice. Yeah. The Buddha was interested in what is true, but he was most interested in what was helpful. And so in that spirit, again, my interest is particularly pragmatic.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. So that would address both the project of neuropsychology, drawing on what we have learned about the brain to support us in our psychological well-being, as well as the project that's the title of your most recent book, Neurodharma, but also that shows up in Buddha's brain and your other work. Why not draw on this wealth of contemporary information that we have to the degree that it can help us understand practices that engage the body, that engage consciousness, that engage craving and clinging and holding. And is there anything else you would want to say about Neurodharma before we get into the specifics about the article that you published for BCBS?
Well, first, let me correct. I said Thomas Metzinger. As you point out, it's Thomas Nagel, What It's Like to Be a Bat. So credit where credit is due. And second, I think of Neurodharma, and I offer that kind of terminology respectfully. And I was quite happy that many others besides me have, put together words like eco, with the Dharma, eco-Dharma, David Loy and so forth. So we can know ourselves in two ways. We can know ourselves from a first-person perspective, in a sense from the inside out. What's it like to be me right now? Like what is happening? What is occurring? Okay. And we can also know ourselves from the outside in, from the third-person perspective. Both of them are really useful. And for me, Neurodharma, in the larger context of an interest in the upper reaches of human potential, including all the way to full awakening. For me, Neurodharma is my kind of respectful offering about where these two perspectives can meet and the ways in which it can be helpful to toggle back and forth between them. To use some of the distinctions, for example, that are laid out in the Pali Canon and other early texts in Buddhism, to apply those distinctions to the brain and ask yourself, how in the world could cessation occur? Neurologically, how in the world could you have a brain that is, how in the world could you have a body, a person who's utterly free of greed, hatred, and delusion, since we evolved to be greedy, hateful, and deluded in many kinds of ways? The well-intended process of evolution, because it's greed, hatred, and delusion are very effective ways to keep animals alive in the wild, even if they're not very happy along the way. Right? How could that be? Flip the other way. When you start knowing some of how the machinery works under the hood, inside your head and throughout your whole body, that starts to take you into greater insight. It sharpens your insight into your own subjective processes, and it's very motivating to know that that your bad habits, as it were, the mind takes the shape from what it repeatedly rests upon, is the proverb. The brain takes its shape from what we rest our minds upon, particularly given the brain's negativity bias. And when you get that, you start becoming more motivated to pay close attention to where your attention is rested and what's your relationship to what it's resting upon. It's motivating. It also helps you really prioritize some of the 10,000 tools in the Buddhist warehouse. Right? There's so many practices. And it's not that you're using brain science to invent new practices, although brain science is leading us towards certain things like using psychotropic meds effectively for people in ways that are pragmatically respectful. Like there's a place for antidepressants or potentially psychostimulants, as skillful means, but especially things like neurofeedback or my own emphasis on deliberately helping the brain internalize beneficial experiences. I mean, I've really never seen that explicitly foreground in any of the Dharma trainings I've known or seen. It's kind of implicit to marinate in a beneficial experience so it really lands inside you. But it's not that approach. There's nothing about that that's taught systematically to people. And so that's been something that I've engaged myself, informed by evidence-based neuroscience, about how to actually promote lasting changes of neural structure and function. So what you're trying to develop and cultivate, bhavana, in other words, cultivation, actually lands. So brain science can occasionally, I think, offer unique value. But one of its great benefits is to spotlight for particular individuals some of the many methods in the warehouse of tools, like the one I offered in the meditation. A sense of Gestalt awareness, things as a whole. Those practices, I'm aware of them in the Hindu tradition. I'm not particularly aware of any guidance along those lines in the Buddhist tradition, but there may well be. I'm not saying I invented it. But on the other hand, when you understand that most of our suffering involves activity in the midline of the cortex, either task-oriented in the front or spacing out and mind-wandering default mode in the back, that engages things as parts in a linear way with a strong sense of self. But on the other hand, when you learn that being aware of and I see the comment that's come in, about Thich Nhat Hanh. I'll get to that in a second. When you're aware that when you learn that awareness of things as a whole reduces activity in this midline, brings to bear networks on the sides of the brain, especially right-sided, that have much less sense of self as a result of what they do, you suddenly realize, oh, I should include this more in my practice, the sense of things as a whole, because it has a particular beneficial effect. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer, and I do want to acknowledge, certainly Thich Nhat Hanh, whom I revere, bless his memory, did definitely talk about cultivating positive seeds. And he actually was kind and endorsed hardwiring happiness in a beautiful kind of way. But the systematic approach to the internalization of beneficial experiences that's grounded in multiple evidence-based methods that I've put forward, including in Hardwiring Happiness, my structure of the HEAL framework, the acronym HEAL. I just haven't seen that kind of systematic approach anywhere. So that's
Great. Thank you, Rick. And
yeah.
if you do have questions, feel free to chat them to me, and I'll be asking them to Rick, but not for another 20, 25 minutes. So
Yeah. And if I could, I just again want to emphasize, you don't need brain science to wake up and to, awaken. It's not, I think the people who say you need brain science, to awaken are wrong. And I think people who say you should never look to biology in terms, for anything useful in your spiritual practice, I think they're wrong too.
Well, there is a traditional line of 84,000 teachings of the Buddha, 84,000 Dharma gates, and ideally we find the ones that are supportive of our progress. I'm going to put a link in the chat. This is the link to Rick's article that was published in the BCBS Insight Journal and that we will now be turning towards, so you can have a sense of what specific texts we're looking at. And Rick, maybe to start with, your essay starts exploring this question of suffering. Often we hear in a Buddhist context that all conditioned things are suffering. You want to suggest maybe that's not how one might typically interpret that may not be the best interpretation, but there may still be some truth there. Would you be willing to talk a little bit about dukkha or suffering?
Yeah. As many people know, the Buddha offered 4 truths for the noble ones. That's right. And I think in passing that, what draws us to these truths includes what is noble within us, and what is noble within us is further ennobled by engaging these truths in a beautiful kind of way. The 4 ennobling truths of the Buddha. Now, the first of these is, William, you're a scholar. I defer to you certainly about this. The first truth of dukkha. There is dukkha. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. The second truth is that there is tanha. Well, dukkha, as I understand it, comes in 3 forms, basically. Some experiences are unpleasant. All pleasant experiences end eventually. All phenomena, certainly all mental phenomena, have their nature is to be interdependent and impermanent, thus lacking absolute self-causing identity or essence. That's dukkha. Well, dukkha is not inherently suffering. We suffer because of tanha, which is added to dukkha. And this is the Buddha's, to me, liberating, hopeful, radical proclamation that it is possible to live life with a clear-eyed recognition of dukkha, but with less and less suffering along the way. So what is it about tanha? And therefore, to translate poorly in English, the first noble truth as suffering is a complete mistake, and it swerves away from the central point of the Buddha, that suffering is not inherent. Which takes us to tanha. Tanha, routinely translated as craving. Again, William, please correct me if I got it wrong here, but the Pali word tanha is rooted in, etymologically, thirst. Well, what is thirst? Thirst is a drive state. Something is missing. Something is wrong. Craving is a drive state. Bodies crave. Craving is biological. Craving is a great way to keep monkeys, mice, and lizards alive to see the sunrise, and humans as well. The basis of craving then, it's really interesting. People, in my experience in Buddhist circles, and I've been, banging around with some familiarity with Zen and Tibetan, but mainly in the Theravadan or the tradition of early Buddhism. And I just see routinely people just stop at there is suffering, and the cause of suffering is craving. Well, what's the cause of craving? And the causes of craving that are typically put forth are cognitive. Oh, people make the mental mistake of not of thinking that stuff that is changing is going to be permanent, thinking that there's a substantial self that is an entity kind of inside, thinking that there'll be lasting happiness from changing experiences. Well, squirrels, monkeys, chimpanzees, mice, and lizards crave, and they crave without the cognitive capacity to make those kind of mistakes. Craving is situated in an embodied kind of way. A lot of people pay lip service to mindfulness of the body as a practice. That's fantastic. It's great. But it's really like, if we really care about embodiment, we should pay attention to how the body makes craving. Why does the body crave? Well, the body craves when it feels like there's a deficit or a disturbance in the meeting of a major need, like safety, satisfaction, or connection. So when we feel threatened, we can tip into craving to manage that fear and to find safety. If we feel unsatisfied, thwarted, life is empty, disappointed, frustrated, we move into drivenness around satisfaction. Similar thing in our interpersonal area. Very understandable, but this takes us, to me, to really appreciating pragmatically the value of doing two things to help us engage the challenges of life without the craving that causes suffering. There may still be some habits of craving. There may be subtleties of what could be called craving, just that are, baked into being an animal, a big land mammal is what we are, right? But if we do these two things, I'm going to tell you in a second, the actual biological basis in your body for craving starts to fall away. The first of these is to develop various psychological resources inside that can enable us to meet challenges to our needs without being invaded by that. And think of many examples where people are, their need for safety is being challenged. I've done a lot of rock climbing that challenged my need for safety. People drive in traffic that challenges their need for safety, and yet they function and cope without, as the Buddha talked about it, feelings of fear or helplessness or anger to invade themselves and remain, right? We can also pursue goals in the face of frustration. We can dream big dreams. We can aspire, but we can do these things if we feel psychologically resourced to do it on the basis of fullness and balance rather than deficit and disturbance. Same with our relationships. We can enter into relationships with an underlying sense of compassion and kindness and self-worth that enables us to meet challenges in our relationships. Again, without tipping into shame or ill will, resentment, and so forth. And that's the opportunity. But if you don't have the psychological resources that enable you the inner strengths to cope with challenges, then of course we feel flooded by the challenges. And by the way, obviously, external conditions matter a ton. There's nothing in what we're saying here, at least in my view, that is downplaying the political. Obviously, if people are in poverty, their needs are not being met, or they're being systematically oppressed and with racism and so forth and other things, that is important too. I'm not leaving it out. I'm just saying, okay, if we though start looking just inside the mind with respect for how important external conditions are, what do we see? The other thing, last, that helps people gradually eliminate or really, really reduce the underlying embodied somatic, emotional, basis for craving is to internalize many times a day, if you can, the felt sense of needs met enough in the moment. In the present, whatever the future can hold, in the present, if you feel that you're basically all right now, that's a wonderful experience to help sink in. If you feel in the present, grateful and content, even if you still have some goals, even if around the edges you feel like you have more to do than you have time to do it in. I know William and I certainly feel that, probably just about everyone listening. That's around the edges, but in your core, you feel okay. Take it in. And then relationships, when there's a sense of love and other forms of caring flowing out, feel it. Let it sink in. When you feel seen or appreciated, liked, respected, or loved, slow down. Let it sink in. And in that way, a breath at a time, we can literally hardwire into emotional memory the felt sense of needs met enough already. So then when our challenges come to needs, they land on what feels like an already unconditional, not dependent on external conditions, unconditional core of resilient well-being. So I know I said a lot in that whole run. That's it. What do you think?
That was a lot. And it sounds like it's something you have thought through a lot and it flows pretty smoothly.
Mm.
There were a couple things that came to mind. One is that, in fact, the suttas, the early Buddhist tradition, may have a somewhat similar view as you do about embodiment. In the suttas, you find this idea that there's an underlying tendency towards grasping and craving that is precognitive. So even an infant has this underlying tendency without any conceptual framework of an I or a self. And yeah, go ahead.
I could just build on that one little thing, which is that I think insight practices are fantastic. And on the other hand, if the truth is in your body, you feel traumatized and rattled and desperate, even with relatively affluent conditions, but somehow in your core, you feel like you're running on empty. I mean, insight practices don't have as much traction as they might possibly have if you put out many of those fires inside, or at least damped them down.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of what you're talking about is practices that create a foundation to do the kinds of practices that one might typically do in a Dharma retreat, and cultivating the kind of resilience, kind of calm, kind of strength. So one of the points that you make, Rick, is that in some way in our lives, there are going to be physical and emotional pains. That is, yes, the Buddha was right that everything is impermanent, and there's a sense of transience in our life and our experiences and the people we love and our own capacities, and physical and emotional pain is part of that. But you also want to suggest that there's a way in which we don't have to suffer all that much with these pains. I'm wondering if you could, that might sound somewhat counterintuitive, that, well, there's pain but not suffering. I wonder if you could flesh that out a little bit.
Right. And call me crazy. I feel like what we're talking about here is Buddhism 101. I mean, it's very core to it. And I'm not taking, any issue, because it was the Buddha, for example, who really pointed out that, let's go back to the 3 kinds of dukkha. Okay. He pointed out that, yes, some experiences are unpleasant, right? And the examples given are mainly physical. I would want to add social experiences. You lose someone you love, your heart will be heavy. There's an inherency to that. I remember a long time ago, a teacher telling me in an interview on retreat, just talking about equanimity, that she would never want to have a heart so equanimous that it did not feel sorrow at injustice or misfortune for those she cared about. Those are the first darts of life in the Buddhist metaphor, first arrows. And the Buddha certainly pointed out that we can do a lot of things. Traditional practices, modern forms of psychotherapy, we could do a lot of things so that we can just stay with the first dart, holding it in spacious awareness, hopefully with some compassion for ourselves and some insight into its nature as a non-binding, foamy, quivering, vibrating kind of experience that is more like a cloud than a brick. You know, hopefully we can practice with the first darts of life without adding the second, third, and fifth darts that we throw ourselves, of getting contracted around it, getting angry about it, medicating ourselves with drugs and alcohol about it, and all those other problems. So right off the first kind of dukkha, there is pain, the kind of glib summary, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional, in the sense that suffering is something that we add to, our experiences in various ways. Second kind of dukkha, all pleasant experiences end, yeah, well, so do unpleasant experiences. They all end too. Like, it's not an inherent problem. It doesn't make life inherently unsatisfactory or unsatisfying that pleasant experiences end. They end. Okay. We can have wisdom about that. We can also understand that as the pleasant experience ends, very often there's an arising of another wholesome, potentially wholesome and enjoyable experience, including the sense of lovingness and good heart in ourselves as a background, even in our mood. And it's actually wonderful that all pleasant experiences end, because it means that unpleasant ones end too, right there, not inherently suffering. And then the last one is, phenomena. There is this sort of unsettling, right? Foamy and substantial, continually changing nature to certainly mental phenomena and most, if not all, physical phenomena in the Big Bang universe. And yet we don't have to make it a problem. We can get used to it, right? We can be buoyed by the fact that there's also an endless arising. We can feel profoundly grateful, as I do, I bet you do too, for the ways in which we are lived by by the interconnectedness means we are being lived by life, by this vast network that extends into nature, it extends into culture, it extends back in deep time, and to the evolution of this planet. It extends all the way back to the extraordinary givingness of the freaking Big Bang. Whoa! So like, the third kind of dukkha is not itself inherently suffering, and so I think that now, to be able to live in a world of dukkha, and there's more to the world than just dukkha, particularly the first two things. The third kind of dukkha is pervasive, it's everywhere, but the first two, there's more to life than just those two things. But in any case, to be able to live in this way, is practice. I've been meditating for 50 years and I'm going to need at least another 50, but I'm not sure I'm going to get them, and the Buddha taught many, many practices. And I believe in the relationship, loosely between effort and realization. I mean, there's a place for that, and respect for teachers. And in my case, people who are farther along than I am, that I keep trying to learn from. Like, we have stuff to do, but we're not doomed. If you say life is suffering, what are you left with? You're left with the project that does kind of, show up from time to time, at least as tone, in some places in the Pali Canon and in some teachers today, that, if you don't think life sucks, you're not paying attention. It's like, that's their bumper sticker. And I'm like, that's so not true. We need to address suffering, but we're not going to address it skillfully if we inflate what it actually is or what its causes actually are. And if we downplay the beautiful possibility, the good news, proclaimed by the Buddha. What do you think of that rant?
I think you can go on tour.
No.
So
well, can I just for me also, it's important to, I love the Dharma and I love my teachers and I love the Pali Canon. I get so much out of it, especially a decent translation, Bhikkhu Bodhi, Bhikkhu Analayo and others, and man, I think we can get stale in our practice. We can start just living with Buddhist platitudes that we don't step back and inspect. And and we can lose a certain playfulness, I think, as well in our practice that, has pitfalls in it. We have to be careful about it and so forth. But I just think it's okay. It's okay to kick the tires of Buddhism and go, is life really suffering? Right? Or what causes craving? And how can I take that into account in my everyday life in a way that will help me and help others suffer less too, that I affect?
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that. I personally am not interested in a practice that does not bring joy. And I actually don't think any practice that doesn't bring joy is sustainable.
Yeah.
A practice that does not cultivate a sense of open-hearted joy, gratitude,
Yeah.
tranquility, is not one that I would want as a primary spiritual practice.
Yeah.
And which raises, that doesn't mean that the world that we face isn't one that has great suffering in it. And how does one respond to that suffering without being numb? And this is the kind of thing that Joanna Macy is really wise on, that mass extinction and inequality and racism and transphobia and fat phobia and climate change. Maybe I'll ask this as a question. I have found that for some people, when they hear the kind of account that you give, that there is a tension kind of built into our bodies, that we have vulnerable animal bodies and vulnerable animal bodies with needs, and that some of our cravings are kind of deeply embedded in our evolutionary history, that there's a way in which that gives people a sense it's not my fault. I'm not bad at this. There's a way in which this is how I'm navigating the world right now. And the fact that I still have these cravings, I'm not gonna say, oh, I suck at this practice. I'm gonna be where I am and work with it and give myself some tenderness. As a friend of mine likes to say, oh, sweetie, and have some compassion for myself. And at the same time, there are these texts and teachers and advanced practitioners who talk about attaining a state, or maybe not a state, that might be too refined, but in longer meditation retreats, that tension, that suffering is allowed to release. And I'm wondering, if someone were to say, well, what do you mean there's always a little bit of tension there? What about these experiences that I've had? And what about these experiences that the Buddha describes or that one finds in the suttas? How might you respond to something like that?
I asked Gil Fronsdal, who I know is now teaching at BCBS, a personal question a few years ago, and I have a lot of respect for Gil. I know him pretty, somewhat well. And I asked him, what are you doing these days, Gil, in your personal practice? I had the audacity to ask him that. And he was kind, he was smiled. I think we were having lunch together or something. And he said, in a really sweet way, I stopped for suffering. And it wasn't glib. You knew it was real. And he was talking about his own suffering and that of other people. I stopped for suffering. So an awareness and a mindfulness of including subtleties of suffering is really helpful. And related to that, I highly recommend mindfulness of craving, including pretty granular, real time. So over shorter and shorter time intervals, that kind of granularity, and also granularity of the field of consciousness. You're looking at more and finer and finer things in your own experiencing, an awareness of the contraction or sense of pressure that is pretty central to any experience of craving. And observe the rise and fall of craving. Craving itself is impermanent. Craving's an experience, and it's also an underlying physical process. So you have mind and matter to co-relating, co-occurring, right? And very often, what you'll realize, which is amazing, is that you'll find yourself craving. You'll find yourself contracting around a potential threat or resisting it, or you'll find yourself feeling really frustrated about something, or you'll find yourself obsessing about something that happened in a relationship. And yet, if you look at reality in the present, you're basically okay. Actually, in the present, you're not dying, you're not falling apart, the threat has not landed, it's a maybe, and you're dealing with it, right? So what there is a lot is the habit of craving, a kind of auto craving that actually often doesn't have a real basis. The body does it habitually and to some extent designed by evolution to do it. But when you start observing again and again, wow, I can deal with this situation without feeling so contracted and driven and craving, and I can deal with it with a spaciousness that, has preferences, has values. I'm going for certain things, but there's like a willingness to tolerate and to be at peace with whatever ultimately happens. There's an equanimity. We expand. To quote Gil, he said, I quote him in Neurodharma, the purpose of practice is to expand the range of experiences in which we are free. Right? So I find that to be an extremely helpful thing. And for me, it's been, full of almost amusement to just watch my mind and me, as it were, craving, when actually I don't have to. It's basically okay. Okay, good. Part one. Part two, you're referring to a point I made that has puzzled me in deep meditative states where the mind is very, very calm. And even in the jhana states, let's say the first several of that are named in the right concentration, wise concentration element of the Eightfold Path. And there you are, you're really spacious, really quiet, mostly just awareness. And yet you can feel almost subtly in the background a certain tension in the ongoing cognizing, if you will, or the ongoing constructing of experience. And to live and for the nervous system to operate, it has to do two things that are contradictions. It has to stabilize what's changing and it has to segment or partition what is connected. To be able to recognize the banana distinct from the hand that holds it, let's say, and to keep zeroed in on the banana-ness, banana. And that necessary, like I'm saying, holding on to what's changing or stabilizing what's changing and partitioning what's connected, I think has a subtle inherent tension in it. And it is possible. And there are people who've had meditative experiences beyond my own to drop into states of being, the fourth jhana, and then the formless realms beyond that, and certainly cessation by definition is a cessation, of ordinary processes, certainly of mental neural activity. I would say then may be, that the awareness of that inherent process in our neurology, of stabilizing and segmenting may fall away. But for the nervous system to operate, it's got to continuously try to stabilize what's changing and segment what's connected. And that can leave a certain subtle tension in us. And yet, what's our relationship to it? In a sense, maybe that's a fourth kind of dukkha. That's, guess what? You got a body, you got a life, comes with a package. And yet, if we understand that subtle form of, tension or contraction that's just kind of built into having a functioning nervous system, we don't have to resist it. We don't have to, be hijacked by it, and we can relax around it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Rick. Maybe I'll ask one last question. I already have 2 pages of questions that have come in,
Awesome.
been putting together.
Yeah.
But I want to ask one last question of you before we. Um,
May I make a key point before you do that, which
sure.
is just simply, I don't believe in positive thinking. I believe in realistic thinking, And for me, there's a kind of three phrases that summarize a lot. Deal with the bad, as you define it. Turn to the good, take in the good. In other words, don't turn into the good or take in the good as a spiritual bypass. In fact, it's through growing strengths of various kinds inside ourselves, the traditional 7 factors of awakening, developing, right? Investigation, energy, mindfulness, tranquility, and so forth. Developing the qualities that are named in the Eightfold Path, developing these qualities, and then some from traditional psychology like secure attachment, executive functions, distress tolerance, impulse control, et cetera, et cetera. This helps make us more able to deal with the bad in life and help others, right? Life is challenging, for sure it's challenging. And I'm not in any way, shape, or form talking about looking at life through rose-colored glasses. It's actually out of a clear-eyed recognition of the tough parts of life and a recognition of the way that the evolved brain is tilted negatively. It's tilted towards suffering and craving because that's a great way to pass on genes that pass on genes, right? It's out of a clear-eyed recognition of those things that I've really emphasized the process of the cultivation of various strengths inside and develop in general the capacity to learn from the experiences you're having in lasting ways. I think practice broadly is like a 3-legged stool, 3 qualities, metta, sati, and bhavana, in Pali, as it were, loving, knowing, and growing. And people routinely leave out that 3rd leg of the stool of growing. They're having all kinds of great experiences, but not much is sinking in, really, because they don't know how to help it sink in, which has been a major focus of mine. But it's informed by this clear-eyed, pretty realistic, jaundiced view of the state of the world. Yeah.
Jaundiced is not the first word that comes to me when I think of you, Rick, but I'll take your word for it. So I feel like you've already addressed this question in various ways, but I also feel like it's important to ask because it's something that comes up sometimes when one hears about integrating neuroscience, neuropsychology, and the Dharma, the project of Neurodharma. There's some people who talk about this as a kind of a critique of the idea of a meditating brain, as if it's just in there and not interconnected with social, cultural, environmental, embodied meaning, and as if we could best know the brain that is meditating and make progress through neuroscience. And I could imagine someone seeing the titles of your books, Neurodharma, Buddha's Brain, and saying, oh, that must be what Rick is doing. And I'm curious to hear how you might respond to someone who would say that.
Well, if I get it right, and people I respect immensely, like Evan Thompson, have been associated with that critique to some extent, for sure. And to be clear, as the Buddha taught, this moment of consciousness for you, for me, for anyone participating here, is a local expression of a vast network of causes. It's like the single wave, 1,000 miles out in the Pacific Ocean is the result of all the causes and conditions in the planet as a whole, in some broad sense. That's totally true. It's also true that the final common pathway of the causes streaming through us to make this moment of hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, etc., primarily those runs right between your ears. That's just a fact. And so if we look at the causes of the next moment of consciousness, and we look at and we explore causes of suffering that are built into the basic design of the brain and or have been acquired through a person's history, including, let's say, through trauma or just through accumulating habits of an ordinary life. If we look to those causes that are more locally situated, it doesn't mean necessarily that we're ruling out the other ones. We're just looking at these. And yeah, it's really important to take a look at flows of, dopamine and oxytocin and all that related, more broadly to society and everything else. But it's not either or. Point one. Point two, most people that I know, who publish academically in this territory or who have any interest in sort of a person in talking about a personal practice that's informed in some way with a third person understanding of the embodied processes in which the mind is situated, they don't, in my experience, are not reductionistic, typically. Now, if someone, to sell a book or something, goes overboard, well, that person's gone overboard. But in general, I just don't think we need to fear it. And, I think there's something about science that seems heady and Spock-like and kind of weird and alarming, and it can create a kind of privileged club of people who speak the dialect, right? And I think that's an important concern to really address. For me, it actually is part of, the broad revolutionary project of having a world in which compassion and justice is the basis for all human societies. It supports that and a world in which actually as well, the suffering of all sentient beings, including non-human beings, is really taken into account. It supports that to recognize our kinship with our animal cousins and the whole network of life altogether. It supports that. And it supports people realizing that beyond our socially constructed distinctions, race, gender, this or that, there is a basic human brain. We all share it. And there are universals, there are universal processes, and we can find our kinship with other members of the human tribe in part by having the humility to appreciate the degree to which their brain's like ours, basically. Ours is like theirs. And, to me, it just supports tolerance and values of tolerance, values of inclusion. It helps us really appreciate how vulnerable people are. We're so vulnerable. The brain is designed to be changed by our experiences, particularly negative ones, especially early negative experiences in childhood that happen with other people, right? And when you start to appreciate that and the impact of that on other people, it changes how you are. One thing that's really landed for me in all this is an appreciation of the negativity bias of the brain. I call it, we have a brain that's like Velcro for bad experiences, but Teflon for good ones. And when you realize that about other people, how vulnerable they are to being affected by you, with respect, you don't walk on eggshells or muzzle yourself, but you have a deeper feeling of empathy and benevolence, thus compassion. That's what compassion is together for other people.
Great, thank you. One of the questions that came in is about healthy craving, as in desire to want to learn and play an instrument, for example. Isn't that healthy?
Great. That's great. So again, I defer to you on definitely the terminology. My understanding is the Buddha distinguished between Tanha and Chanda in Pali, and Chanda broadly would be wholesome desire, such as wise intention, right there in the Eightfold Path. Wise intentions, those are desires of a sort. Those are wants, to want a child to be fed, to want yourself to flourish, to want to actualize your capabilities. So you feel like you're really using yourself, to want your business to succeed, to want to learn to play an instrument. It's fine. Now that said, the brain is designed to want what it likes and to crave that which is rewarding. And I think sometimes people play kind of fast and loose with the lingo of Tantra and, and embodied practice. Well, don't underestimate the power of the brain. The trick, I think, is to stay in touch with liking without tipping into wanting in this contracted sense of craving, tanha, driven, pressured, saturated typically with I. As a detail, it's certainly true that the construction of the sense that there's some kind of enduring, unified, and independent entity inside who is me, quote unquote, right? That definitely creates craving and thus suffering. Flip the other way, you can watch your mind. There you are, little sense of self, just rolling along. Suddenly, there's a penetrating threat or a juicy opportunity, or another person has done something, and you can watch a kind of a craving response to it, on the heels of which 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds later, there becomes a growing, developing sense of self. So I think that craving constitutes selfing, at least as much as selfing, creates craving. So I think about all that. And in your brain, this is super cool. There's in your subcortex, the kind of early mammalian part of the brain, in the basal ganglia, which we share with really developed crocodiles, I've been told, but basically it's mammalian. In the basal ganglia is a little part called the nucleus accumbens. It's also called the ventral, which means lower striatum. The point is, and here I'm drawing from the great science of Kent Berridge, Berridge, you can look up his papers. Bottom line, inside the nucleus accumbens are these little nodules, these tiny little, like maybe a cubic millimeter, I'm not sure exactly how big they are, of neural tissue, which can include a lot of synapses. You could put 5,000 or so, several thousand synapses side by side in the width of just one hair. It's a lot of action in a cubic millimeter. Okay. Some little nodules do liking for what's pleasant. Others do wanting what's pleasant. There's a distinction between liking and wanting, and its polarities reversed. There are other little nodules that do not liking and wanting what's unpleasant to go away. The point is, liking and wanting are neurologically decoupled. And as the proverb puts it, liking without wanting is heaven. Wanting without liking is hell. So I find it's really useful when we're engaging healthy desire to, one, keep tracking that distinction between liking and wanting, and keep having some granularity of mindfulness of subtleties of craving, including in your body. And second, as you enjoy what you're doing, and as you progress in, let's say, the musical instrument, really help those beneficial experiences to sink in, so that increasingly over time, you feel already full as you move into the next moment or it arises.
Yeah. Even in the suttas, even tanha or craving is sometimes valorized. That is, there's an example I'm thinking of where Ananda, the Buddha's assistant, says, if you see somebody who's really far along on the path, who's calm and compassionate and has the kind of presence that you might want, it is skillful and helpful to crave, to have a self like that, to crave for a certain kind of self that is wholesome and calm and caring and thoughtful. And as one makes progress towards that, maybe one loses some attachment to the self that was a kind of helpful energizer to make progress in that direction. And there are other kinds of cravings that can be used skillfully. So I guess when I think of those passages, again, I think of not being too hard on ourselves.
Yeah.
We can have certain kinds of cravings, even tanha, which is typically associated with suffering and negativity, but it can help us make progress in the direction that we might want to go.
Yeah, I think, someone running into a burning building to pull their kid out, or someone intensely standing up against social injustice. You know, there in the it could be. I mean, it could be necessary, right? Um, on the other hand, for me, it's been extremely interesting to explore the space where there can be wholesome aspirations, there can be intensity, there can be fieriness, there can be outrage without hatred invading the heart, without um, feeling pressured or contracted in the core. That's really an interesting exploration. You know, dukkha without tanha. You know, engaging life. Well, I call it in the green zone. You know, on the basis of underlying sense of peacefulness, contentment, and love, rather than fear, frustration, and heartache as we move forward in life. And then gradually, as Gil would put it, building out our capacities to deal with greater and greater challenges while resting in that resilient well-being.
So, speaking of resilient well-being, one of the questions that came in was if you have any thoughts about how to approach the climate crisis without a sense of doom.
Well, I think it's profound. I mean, I'm in it. I think first start, we can have experiences of eco-melancholia. That's a term of 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 dreadful fear, of outrage that I think stupid humans, right? We can feel all those things. To me, the question, what's so beautiful and what the Buddha taught is that he had room for all of our experiences. His key is what's our relationship to those experiences. So we can recognize the facts, we can have, feelings about it of all kinds. Then the question becomes, do they invade the mind and remain? Do those experiences invade us, hijack us, overwhelm us, cripple us in our capacities to move forward and all the rest of that? And the opportunity in practice is to be mindful of these experiences with wisdom and with compassion, without being, to me, defeated by them. And it also is really helpful to appreciate, again, a little, brain science goes a long way here, that we're vulnerable to acquiring a sense of learned helplessness. Mammals, including us, are very vulnerable to developing a sense of futility and defeat. We're vulnerable to that, so we have to be really careful about it. It's like we're vulnerable to gorging on carbohydrates because back in the Serengeti Plains, you couldn't store food. So if you found anything sweet, eat it now. We're vulnerable to learned helplessness. So it's extremely important to focus on where you do have efficacy, where you do have agency, whether it's about the climate crisis in some way, your part to help the world, or other things. So I find that really important. And I'm myself, I take heart from people around the world who are starting to focus on this and, take it seriously and wrap our arms around it. I take heart from people like Yuval Harari, who have pulled together an extremely well researched plan for capping climate change worldwide at 3 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century, rather than the 5 or more degrees Fahrenheit on average, we're headed toward, which would be catastrophic. And it costs about 2% of the gross domestic product of the countries of the world annually. But for 2%, we can save the planet. 2%, a lot of which could be achieved by blocking tax loopholes for rich people. Hello. So anyway, I'm heartened by these kinds of things. We're not done. The future is to be fought for. I just finished watching For All Mankind, a series on Apple TV. That's an unsolicited plug. And they put in the words of one of the main characters, maybe close to something he said, Gene Kranz. The future is ours to fight for and to win. And we should not give up. And I'm extremely interested in other kind of thing I'm doing in vast coalitions of millions of people and organizations banding together, much as we did in hunter-gatherer times, in which, forgive the expression, the betas banded together to regulate the alphas. And today we have alphas with tremendous wealth and power that need to be regulated. Otherwise, they're going to drag all of us across the cliff, and certainly our children and their children's children. So I'm very hopeful about the formation of large coalitions of people that have the money and power that can actually make significant, substantial change happen over the long haul. And I think that's how we need to go.
Inshallah, may that be the case.
Yeah.
Someone asked about when I was talking, what did I really mean, Tanha? And I'm just going to put a link in the chat to Anguttara Nikaya, Anguttara Nikaya 4:159, where craving to end craving is
interesting. Yeah.
and Tanha is used there. There were, I think, more than one person was wondering about that.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of really good questions here.
I know.
And
I haven't seen them. I have not seen them, but I'm sure they're there. Yeah.
One question that I think might be worth exploring is what somebody asked about, a follow-up question about what Gil Fronsdal had said to you, I stopped for suffering. And perhaps he didn't unpack what that meant, but I find it really evocative. And I'm wondering if you could say what you interpreted him to mean by saying, I stopped for suffering.
It felt very tender. And as you know, Gil, I hope he doesn't take offense at this description of him. He's very bright and has a very sly sense of humor and provocative. And there was a sweetness and a tenderness in what he had to say that startled me. I can see his face right now, 20 years later, probably, or maybe 15. And I think he was also talking about compassion for others, and I think the Buddha stopped for suffering in a sense. He really kept appreciating, including subtleties of suffering, as he progressed in his own personal practice through the formless realms, through the formless jhanas. He could feel the subtle contraction that still remained. He hadn't yet liberated himself entirely. And I think for us to be honest about our suffering is really important, while also appreciating that if you just observe your mind, your experience, just leave it at that, there's so much about it that in the moment is not suffering, right? The field of awareness itself is not suffering, right? So much of what is present in the mind almost all the time is neutral or pleasant, with maybe tiles in the mosaic of the mind that are hot red and are pain points for people. Okay, that's real. What else is true? What else is true? So for me, it's important to not get to stop for suffering, but not get stuck there, right? And this is the opening to my book, Neurodharma, if you let me read the first paragraph. I think we have around us so many beautiful examples of people who are drawing us onward. So I'll read it to you. I've hiked a lot in the mountains, and sometimes a friend farther up the trail has turned and looked back and encouraged me onward. Such a friendly gesture. Come join me. Watch out for the slippery ice. You can do it. I've often thought about those moments while writing this book, which is about the heights of human potential, about being as wise and strong, happy and loving as any person can be. If those heights are like a great mountain, awakening is the magnificent journey that carries you along toward the top. Many real people have gone very far up, the great sages and teachers throughout history, as well as others no one has heard about. And I imagine them turning with a sweet smile and beckoning us to join them. That's the invitation of the Buddha, to to engage a practice that, as he put it, is good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, and in which we don't get stalled out at intermediate stages, and that we keep pursuing the heartwood of the complete liberation of mind and heart. That is, the essence, the goal, the purpose of the spiritual path. And to not, for me, it's just really important, especially, in my own life of practice, to look at ways that we can actually cultivate qualities that we see in people who are farther along, and even begin to reverse engineer a little bit in an informed way what enables them to do that, right? How do they keep an open and loving heart in the face of those who are attacking them, right? How do they actually experience being one with everything? What? What do they mean when they talk about unconditioned timelessness? How can you have profound equanimity while still having a human body, that can have pain and feels hunger? And how can you be equanimous? So for me, it's the opportunity is to appreciate people who, in their own life, have gone up that mountain of awakening. They follow different routes, but on each of those routes are kind of, for me, 7 fundamental steps that we see again and again, having to do with steadying the mind, warming the heart, resting in equanimity and fullness, and coming into the present with a sense of wholeness that opens out into everything, and mysteriously, and is nested in mystery. Yeah, with some gusto. Let's keep going, right? We don't need to know exactly how it is on the very tippity top of the mountain. We just need to know that we're on a path with heart, and the next step is worth taking.
I am ready to start going up that mountain. And
you're far along, William.
And maybe that's a good note to segue to for those of you who are interested in continuing this exploration with Rick, and who find Rick's enthusiasm contagious as I do. Rick is offering a day-long program. There's a link in the chat. It's co-sponsored by Lion's Roar, Being Well, and us, the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. And it explores 7 practices of highest happiness that are described in the book, but this would be an opportunity to do it online in person with Rick.
With a lot of experiential practice. It'll be a day of kind of sequential practice, moving through these 7 qualities of steadiness, lovingness, fullness, wholeness, nowness, allness, and timelessness in an experiential progression.
Interactive, experiential, and that takes place on September 10th. And we are not used to doing things quite in this way, but I just put in a link. I just put in the chat a code that if you use it, BCBS 50, you will get $50 off as you continue this exploration with Rick. So thank you so much, Rick, for the last 2 parts of our evening. I'm going to turn it back to you.
Oh, that's really beautiful. And one thing I'd like to, if I could offer, is the teaching of the Buddha. Apparently, as he moved through, northern India in his 40-year roughly teaching career, one of the very first things he taught routinely was the importance of generosity. And in our commercial culture, we tend to monetize generosity a lot. We think of it, I'll write a check to this or put some money in the tip jar. There's a place for that. But most forms of generosity are intangible and they're definitely not commercial. The generosity of attention, the generosity of letting another person have their moment in the sun without crowding them out, the generosity of just simple forms of helpfulness for sometimes complete strangers. It's really important to include those non-monetized, non-tangible forms of generosity. That said, in the real world, in which there are power bills and staff expenses and health insurance costs and workers' compensation and land to maintain and all the rest of that, institutions like the Berry Center for Buddhist Studies can really use tangible forms of generosity, both the time of its volunteers and certainly the staff as well, who could probably make a lot more money working for Exxon or something like that. There's a place for supporting BCBS, and I hope you will join me in tangibly offering what's called Dana, one of the key languages of early Buddhism, Pali, the offering. I think William, has put a link in, or they will put a link in. Julia has. If you'd like to make a donation, perhaps in the spirit of this evening, or for more general purposes, or if you'd like to become an ongoing donor for BCBS, something that's been important for me over the years, that you'll feel touched and you'll want to do it. I think the Buddha's encouragement about generosity is give in a way that gladdens the heart. I know for me that in my own practice, generosity broadly has been a huge and growing theme over the last 5-10 years. It's actually kind of blown me away, the impact in my own practice of like the open hand, the open heart, and including intangible forms like a financial donation. So that's my encouragement for you. And as the Buddha taught, do what gladdens your heart. Do what helps you feel good, whatever it might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you for your generosity. And maybe one last act of dana from you. Maybe you could end the evening with maybe just a 2-minute meditation.
Oh, thank you again. And I want to express my gratitude to you, William. You really prepped for this. People aren't quite aware, but you really definitely did the work. And thanks for all of you who are participating, and thanks you as well, Julia. If I could, I'll share a little meditation that involves 3 kinds of breaths, 3 breaths. And you can do it 3 breaths in a row. It'll take a few more than 3 breaths for me to teach it right here. I find it really sweet. And it's grounded in some good brain science as to why it works. So in the first breath, as we did previously, breathe while feeling your chest as a whole. I'll be doing it with you. In the second kind of breath, bring awareness to the area around your heart and breathing while feeling caring. Keeping it simple, bringing to mind beings you appreciate. I'm doing it right now for William and Julia. Beings you care about, perhaps love. Resting in the simple experience of breathing while feeling caring. And then in the third kind of breath, which might be a little more challenging initially, breathing while feeling cared about. Keeping it simple, simple experiences of being appreciated, liked, or loved. And as we finish, we can rest in the sense of caringness, lovingness, flowing in and flowing out, perhaps particularly in the area of the heart. Love is love, whether it's flowing in or flowing out, and we can abide, breathing with an open heart. Thank you very much. Thank you all. And thank all those who have been the causes and conditions for the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies over all these many years.
Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. And I look forward to seeing you in Barry or online. In 2 weeks, we'll be having Joseph Goldstein for a conversation about some of these same issues. And maybe some of you will be there. And the week after that is the day long with Rick on September 10th. Good night, everyone.